We're now going to begin talking about sampling. Sampling, quite simply, is the selection of units from a universe or a population for study. The question of sampling is about the adequacy and the appropriateness of the sample. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how we ascertain this and the core concepts of research methodology that are involved in determining the appropriateness and the adequacy of a sample. Whenever we are dealing with the generalizability of a research that's conducted using a sample, the question that we're dealing with is one of external validity. External validity is a concept that we briefly touched upon when we talked about different types of validity. External validity, quite simply, is generalizability. Can you take the results of a study that have been conducted using a sample to other places or other people or other contexts? So, the external validity is one of generalizability. There are two ways in which we address generalizability in any research study. The first, the more commonly applied approach, is one of sampling. Sampling is quite simply taking a subset of the population. You draw a sample, you conduct your study on your sample, and whatever are the results of the study, you generalize it, or what we call externalize it, back to the population. What's important in this case is being able to determine whether or not the sample adequately represents the population. If it adequately represents the population, then we can trust those results, and we can say that the same results would be applicable if we did the study using everybody in the population. Okay, so that's your first model. This model is very commonly used because populations, depending on the size of the population, are often too big, too large, or too difficult to study completely. Take, for example, a presidential election. We have the elections coming up next year, and at this point, we have a number of polls that are being conducted to look at the favorability ratings of different nominees. Now, if you wanted to study the favorability of, let's say, Hillary Clinton, what do people think of Hillary Clinton? How favorably inclined are they to vote for her? Doing a study of all 350 million American citizens is almost impossible, because by the time you do this study, regardless of the cost of doing it, her favorability would probably change, because it would take you almost a year or two to do this study. What we end up doing in general is using a sample. Here's an example of a recent Quinnipiac poll that was conducted. You can follow the link and you will find how this poll was conducted and the type of questions they used and the favorability of all the candidates, the Republican as well as the Democratic nominees. As you can see, this study used a sample of 1,500 plus registered voters. So this is one way of doing it. The question becomes, now that we did the study, and if you look at the favorability of Hillary Clinton, 51% of the sample was not favorably disposed towards her. The question of external validity is, can you take these results and say that all Americans, or 51% of Americans, American registered voters, are not favorably inclined towards voting for Hillary? This is a question of external validity. So the one model that we have is the sampling model. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about how we determine the quality of a sample-based study. The second model that's used is one of proximal similarity. The proximal similarity model is a little different from the sampling model. The sampling model depends on taking a sample, drawing a sample, and how we draw it, whether we draw it randomly or using some non-probability technique, all of which we'll discuss soon. That defines the quality, the appropriateness, and the adequacy of the sample. The proximal similarity model uses a different approach. In this approach, what we try to do is we try to get a sample that's as close to being adequate. What does that mean? So let's say we're interested in studying people's craft beer consumption habits. Now, what we might end up doing is finding a location or a place where a lot of craft beer drinkers come together. So that might be, we have Oktoberfest coming up, and perhaps what you might do is find a place where there are beer gardens in Western New York or in some location which brings together a lot of people who are likely to be craft beer drinkers. So what you do there is you try to find what is called as a gradient of similarity. Likewise, let's say you're interested in studying coffee drinking. Maybe what you do is, rather than doing a poll of everybody in a random study of all Americans who are coffee drinkers, what you could do is you could stand outside of Starbucks and get a sample of people who are likely to be what we call proximally similar to the average coffee drinker. Okay? There are a number of threats to external validity depending on the sampling model you use and depending on how we select our sample. So first, it could be the interaction of selection and treatment. This is quite simply saying that maybe the responses that you saw in your study is just a reflection of the people who ended up in your sample. So one of the issues could be that just the people in your sample felt unfavorably towards somebody. So in the Hillary Clinton poll example from Quinnipiac, one of the criticisms of that poll was that the poll had a disproportionately high number of registered Republicans. And if you have higher numbers of registered Republicans, it's quite likely that Hillary's unfavorability was probably a reflection of just these people. Likewise, you can have an interaction of setting and treatment. Let's say you stood outside of Starbucks or a Tim Hortons. You're likely to get different responses depending on whether you're standing outside, let's say, a Starbucks, a Tim Hortons, a McDonald's, or Dunkin' Donuts, because the population of people and the sample that's attracted to each of these locations could potentially be different. Finally, you can have an interaction of history and treatment. It's possible that doing a favorability-unfavorability study just after a hugely negative event is likely to be influenced by the event. So for instance, let's say there was a report about Hillary's email scandal, and then we did a poll right after that. The results that you get will be different than if you did that a month after the event when people have forgotten about it. If you want to find out more about some of the criticisms with the Quinnipiac poll, here's a link to it. This will tell you about some of the issues of selection that influence external validity. So how do we improve external validity? One way of doing it is through random sampling. Random sampling allows us to ascertain the statistical precision of our sample. How we do this, we'll talk about soon. The second way of improving external validity is through replication. When we replicate our study, using a different location perhaps, or a different sample, we can compare the findings using these different samples against each other, and we can determine the extent to which the study gives us consistent results, and that is an argument for external validity. Finally, we can argue for external validity using theory, and here's where the proximal similarity model comes into play. We can talk about how similar our sample is to the other samples out there, and we can make an argument for external validity.